Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down how political influence really works. And we're using one of America's most powerful interest groups as our case study, the National Rifle Association. We'll be mapping out their exact playbook, all based on research from the Journal of Political Sciences and Public Affairs.
Let's just kick things off with a number, a really big number. $250 million. That's roughly the NRA's annual operating budget. It's a huge pot of money that fuels everything they do. But as you're about to see, money is only part of the story.
And then there's this number, 5 million. That's how many members the NRA claims to have. And the research we're looking at says this passionate, engaged base is the real engine of its power. So the big question is, how does this 1-2 punch of money and people actually turn into political influence?
Okay, to really get a handle on the NRA's strategy, we first have to get on the same page about the game they're playing. So let's quickly break down a couple of key terms.
So, at its heart, the NRA is an interest group. This isn't a new idea. In fact, the concept goes all the way back to the founding of the U.S. James Madison was writing about these kinds of groups, or factions, in the Federalist Papers. They are a totally fundamental part of American politics.
And what's the main tool for an interest group? Well, it's lobbying. This is basically the act of trying to influence government decisions. It's all about persuading and pressuring politicians and policymakers, and it is the absolute engine of the NRA's political machine.
Now, if you look at the NRA's official mission, it covers a whole range of things, right? Public safety, hunter education. But for what we're talking about today, we're zeroing in on how the organization builds and uses its political power. And that power really stands on two key pillars.
So, what's really in the NRA's toolkit? Well, it all boils down to two distinct but very connected sources of power: that money we talked about and its people. Let's see how they work together.
And when it comes to their financial firepower, it's not all the same. Get this. Looking at 2014, they spent over $3 million on what's called direct lobbying. You know, talking directly to lawmakers. But look at the number on the right, outside spending. A whopping $28 million on things like political ads. That tells you a lot about their strategy. It's not just about influencing politicians. It's about shaping public opinion itself.
But honestly, the money is only half of it. The organization's real muscle comes from its people. We're talking about a politically fired-up membership that's encouraged to constantly call and write to their legislators. On top of that, you've got a really savvy strategy of hiring former government officials, people who have insider connections. And it's all channeled through their dedicated lobbying arm, the Institute for Legislative Action, or ILA, which they set up way back in 1975 specifically for this purpose.
Okay, so you've got the money, you've got the people. Now, how do they actually use these resources? Well, they apply pressure strategically across all three branches of the U.S. government. It is a very comprehensive approach.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all strategy. The playbook is totally tailored for each branch. Because, Congress, the president, and the courts all have different pressure points, so the NRA has developed specific tactics for each one.
When they're targeting Congress, it's really a two-pronged attack. First, they go after the congressional committees, because that's where new laws get their start. And second, they make campaign contributions to help their political allies get reelected.
And you can see that money strategy crystal clear when you look at the 2012 election cycle. NRA contributions to people running for Congress, well, they had a very distinct pattern. Republican candidates received way more funding than Democrats.
And hey, look what happens just 2 years later in the 2014 cycle. It's the same pattern, but even more pronounced. This just shows a consistent, highly targeted approach to campaign money, heavily favoring one political party.
So what about the executive branch? Well, the game plan shifts. Here, the influence comes from things like lawsuits, suing federal agencies like the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the ATF, and also through those massive ad campaigns during presidential elections.
And finally, you've got the judicial system. Here the approach is a bit more subtle, more legalistic. The key tool here is something called an amicus curiae brief. It basically means friend of the court. It's a legal document that lets an outside group with a strong interest in a case weigh in and try to persuade the judges.
Okay, so that's a lot of theory. Let's look at how these tactics actually work in the real world. A huge Supreme Court case gives us a perfect example of this whole playbook in action.
The case was District of Columbia versus Heller. And what it was all about was a challenge to Washington, D.C.'s super strict ban on keeping handguns in your home. The argument was that the ban violated the Second Amendment.
Now here's what's so fascinating. The NRA didn't actually start this fight. A local resident named Mr. Heller did. But once the case started climbing the ladder to the Supreme Court, the NRA stepped in and played a massive indirect role. It helped get a whole coalition together, 46 other interest groups, to file those friend of the court briefs. Imagine that, a giant wave of legal arguments all supporting Heller's side. And in 2008, the court sided with him. It was a landmark victory, heavily influenced by that coordinated effort.
All right, so we've seen the playbook, we've seen it in action. What's the final verdict here? How powerful is the NRA, really? Well, the conclusion is actually a bit more nuanced than you might expect.
The key takeaway is this. There's no question the organization is powerful. I mean, with that kind of money and millions of dedicated members, of course it is. But, and this is a big but, that power is not absolute. As the research puts it, their power has a limit.
And at the end of the day, that's because of how the U.S. system itself is designed. The NRA can influence, it can persuade, it can apply a ton of pressure, but it can't just write and pass laws by itself. The whole system of checks and balances is there to make sure that only Congress can do that, balancing out all the competing interests.
So this whole breakdown really leaves us with a huge question, and it's not just about one group. In a democracy like ours, how do we find the right balance between the right of a passionate, organized group to make its voice heard and the interest of the general public? It's a tough one, and it's definitely something worth thinking about.